The first topic is childhood as a social construct. Pilcher found in the modern Western notion childhood is marked by separateness, where adults are independent and should look after themselves, whereas children are vulnerable and need protection. This is emphasized through laws and regulations, differences in dress, and products and services. What does childhood as a social construct mean? Sociologists believe that childhood is socially constructed. It's something that's created and defined by society, and it isn't a fixed concept. What we generally perceive as childhood is actually the modern Western notion of childhood. So how does this prove that childhood is a social construct? In Western society, this notion of childhood is often taken for granted and is believed to be natural when it isn't. This separateness of childhood isn't found in all cultures. There's no one type of childhood, so it's not a natural stage. Physically, we may go through the same stages, but different cultures construct the process differently. Benedict argued that in non-Western societies, children are treated differently in three major ways. Firstly, taking responsibility at an early age. Holmes' study in Samoa found that children weren't seen as being too young to undertake tasks, regardless of how dangerous that task was. If a child thought they could handle that activity, parents didn't object. Less value is placed on obedience to adult authority. Firth found that amongst the Tikopia, adult authority wasn't accepted without question by children. And 3. Children's sexual behavior is viewed differently. Malinowski's study of the Trobriand Islanders found that adults took an attitude of tolerance and amused interest towards children's sexual explorations and activities. Benedict concluded that there's much less of a dividing line between the behavior expected of children and adults. Such evidence illustrates that childhood is socially constructed and differs from culture to culture. The next part is, has the position of childhood improved? The march of progress view believes that the position of children has been steadily improving. Here is short to argue that today, children are more valued, better cared for, educated, and have better health and more rights than previous generations. For example, legal protection. The UN have established the rights of the child, which includes entitlement to health care and education, protection from harm, and the right to participate in decisions that affect them. Another is a focus on education over work. There are laws that restrict child labor and exclude children from paid work. From becoming economic assets who could earn a wage, children became an economic liability as they're now financially dependent on their parents. The introduction of compulsory schooling in 1880 had a similar impact, specifically for working class children, lengthening the period of dependency. Furthermore, there are also laws and policies that apply specifically to children. There are minimum ages for drinking, smoking, having sex, driving, gambling, education, and criminality. However, the conflict view criticizes the March of Progress view as it believes that the March of Progress argument is false, as it's based on a false and idealized image of childhood today. They argued that there are inequalities among children in terms of opportunities and risks, and inequalities between children and adults in terms of dependency and control. Firstly, gender. Hillman found that there are greater opportunities for males, such as being more likely to go out after dark unaccompanied, and Bonk found that girls do more domestic labor, especially in lone parent families, where they do 5 times more housework than boys. Secondly, ethnicity. Brannon found that Asian parents are likely to be stricter towards their daughters than any other parents. Thirdly, social class. Children have different experiences of life and childhood based on their social class. Poor mothers are more likely to have low birth weight babies, which is linked to delayed physical and intellectual development, meaning they're likely to be placed on the child protection register. So what does this mean? We can't speak of children in general as if they were all equal, because they aren't. Social class, gender, and ethnic differences affect their life chances. Inequalities between children and adults. Firestone and Hall argue that many of the things that the March of Progress writers see as care and protection are simply new forms of oppression and control. For example, Firestone argues that protection from paid work isn't a benefit to children, but a form of inequality as it makes them more dependent, powerless, and more subject to adult control than before. In what ways does control take form? Neglect and abuse, control over children's space, times, bodies, and their access to resources. The conflict view and age patriarchy. Age patriarchy is a term used by Gittins to describe the inequalities between children and adults. Just as feminists use patriarchy to describe male domination and female dependency, Gittins argues that there's an age patriarchy in which adults dominate and children are dependent. Hockey and James provide evidence that childhood is oppressive. They suggest that children use a strategy of acting up to resist their status and the restrictions that come with being a child. They act like adults through smoking, swearing, drinking, and participating in underage sexual activity. They conclude that modern childhood is a status that most children want to escape. How do critics view the child liberationist view? Critics argue that children can't safeguard their interests and need adult care and social control. Children are also not as powerless as they claim to be. They're protected by the 1989 Children's Act and the UN's Convention on the Rights of the Child. The conflict view, toxic childhood. Palmer argues that children are now experiencing a toxic childhood. Rapid technological and cultural changes in the last 25 years have damaged children's emotional and intellectual development. For example, intensive marketing to children, self-harming, and eating disorders. The next part of this topic is the future of childhood. Postman argues that childhood is disappearing at a dazzling speed. In his view, the cause of first the emergence of modern childhood and now the disappearance of it lies in the rise and fall of print culture and its replacement by television culture. So the disappearance of childhood. In the Middle Ages, most people were illiterate, and speech was the only skill needed for participation in the adult world, so children were able to enter adult society at an early age. Childhood wasn't associated with innocence, and the adult world wasn't associated with mystery. Postman argues that the modern idea of childhood emerged with mass literacy from the 19th century onwards, creating an information hierarchy, a clear division between adults who can read and children who can't. He argues that this culture of mass literacy gives adults the power to keep knowledge a secret from children. These things then became a mystery, and childhood became a time of innocence and ignorance. But the advent of TV blurs the distinction between childhood and adulthood by destroying this information hierarchy. Unlike print media, TV doesn't require special skills to access and makes information available to both adults and children alike. So the boundary between adulthood and childhood is broken down, and the innocence and ignorance is replaced by knowledge. Jenks, childhood in postmodernity. Jenks disagrees with Postman and argues that childhood isn't disappearing but has simply changed. For Jenks, childhood is undergoing another radical change, as we have now entered a less clear-cut societal structure. In the postmodern world, relationships are less stable and the chances of them breaking down are increased, creating a feeling of insecurity. Adults' relationships with their children become more important as a source of adults' identity and instability. Marriage may end in divorce, but you're still a parent. Constant uncertainty has seen adults become more fearful for their children's security, which further strengthens the view of children as vulnerable. Childhood and falling birth and death rates. Childhood may be physically disappearing because of the falling birth and death rates, which are producing an aging population. Fortrup argues that there will be less resources for children as a result. Childhood may become a more isolating experience as families have less children, so there are less children to play with. But it could be argued that their scarcity may make them even more precious, as they're a small percentage of the population and are diminishing compared to other age groups. The new sociology of childhood. This states that the view that childhood is socially constructed risks us viewing childhood from an adult's point of view, according to Mail. We may see children as mere socialization projects for adults to mold, shape, and develop. The new sociology of childhood doesn't view children as simply adults in the making, but instead as active agents who play a major part in creating their own childhoods. Smart, the child's point of view. Smart says the new approach is about the viewpoint of the child. Their study of divorce found that far from being passive victims, children were actively involved in trying to make the situation better for everyone. Such studies may use research methods such as informal, unstructured interviews, which empower children to express their own views and allows researchers to see the world from the child's point of view. This research method is favored by child liberationists who campaign in favor of children's rights and priorities, enabling sociologists to explore the diverse world of childhood where every child's experience is different.